In the villages of the Balkans, people believed the dead could rise from their graves, not as legends but as husbands, shepherds, and farmers who refused to stay buried. Entire communities formed secret rituals to hunt them down. Priests took part. Empires took notice. And history quietly looked away. Tonight, we're uncovering the obscure Balkan vampire cult's history forgot. The real origins of the vampire myth, hidden in fear, faith, and forgotten graves. Thank you for being here and for supporting this channel. Let's begin. Where the dead would not sleep. The bell in Grafen rang only for the living. It told weddings and births, storms and warnings, the passing of kings and the ending of wars. On the night the dead refused to sleep, it rang for none of these things, and yet it rang all the same. Edrin Vale heard it from his room above the apothecary, a single iron note trembling through the floorboards and into his bones. He woke with his hand already on the knife beneath his pillow, heart pounding as though it had been called by the sound. For a long moment he lay still, listening. The bell rang again, slower this time, uneven. Wrong. The dead, he thought. They are stirring. Grafen lay in a shallow valley, its houses huddled together like sheep against the dark. Beyond the last fences, the old cemetery climbed the eastern hill in crooked tiers, headstones leaning at tired angles, half swallowed by moss and time. No one buried their dead there anymore, not since the river flooded and unearthed half a dozen coffins 20 years past. The new graves were farther north, in sanctified ground, watched by wardstones and priests who charged too much and prayed too little. Edrin dressed quickly, shrugging into his coat and boots. The air smelled wrong when he opened the window. Not rot exactly, but cold earth after rain, sharp and expectant. Lanterns flickered to life along the street as other sleepers woke, faces pale in the glow. Somewhere below, a woman whispered a prayer and crossed herself twice. The bell rang a third time. Edrin took the stairs two at a time and emerged into the street. Old Master Corin, the bellkeeper, stood in the square with both hands on the rope, his jaw slack, eyes fixed on the hill. The rope trembled, though Corin was no longer pulling it. "I didn't ring it," the old man said hoarsely when Edrin approached. "It rang itself. That settled it." Bells were bound things, tuned and blessed, taught when to speak and when to stay silent. For one to ring without a hand upon it meant either a miracle, or a breach. The crowd was growing now, drawn by fear as much as sound. Farmers with pitchforks, bakers still dusted with flour, a pair of town guards gripping spears they had never used in earnest. All of them stared at the cemetery hill, where faint lights had begun to bob between the stones like willow wisps. "They're just foxfire," someone said too quickly. Edrin did not answer. He could feel the pressure in the air, the subtle wrongness that pressed against his senses like a bruise. He had been born with it, this awareness, though he had learned early not to speak of it. People did not like those who could feel the dead. They preferred their ghosts quiet and their graves sealed. A cry rose from the hill, thin, wavering, unmistakably human. That broke the crowd. Some ran. Others stood frozen. Edrin moved forward. The path up the hill was slick with dew, the grass flattened as though something heavy had passed that way again and again. As he climbed, the lights resolved into shapes. Pale figures hunched among the stones, their outlines blurred, faces indistinct. They were not walking so much as drifting, tugged by some unseen current. One of them turned its head. Edrin stopped. The face was familiar, though the eyes were wrong, clouded, unfocused, as if looking inward rather than out. "Mara," he said. Mara had died 3 winters ago, taken by fever in the space of a week. He had helped prepare her body, folding her hands, placing the copper penny beneath her tongue. She had been light then, fragile as a bird. Now she stood before him, her form flickering like a reflection on disturbed water. Her mouth moved. No sound came out. Behind her, the earth began to shift. A headstone cracked with a sharp report, splitting down the middle. Soil bulged upward, then fell away as a hand thrust through it, gray, mud-caked, fingers clawing at the air. Another followed. Then another. The dead were not rising all at once. They were waking. Edrin forced himself to breathe. Panic would only make things worse. Fear fed the restless dead, gave them shape and purpose. He reached into his coat and drew out a small charm carved from ash wood, its surface etched with warding marks he had learned from a book that should not have existed. "Stay," he whispered, not to the dead but to the world itself. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the nearest spirit shuddered, its outline sharpening, the ground around the graves settling as though pressed down by an invisible weight. The lights dimmed but did not vanish. Too many, he realized. Whatever was calling them was strong. A sound rose behind him. Boots on stone, labored breathing. One of the guards had followed, face white but determined. "By the saints," the man muttered. "What do we do?" Edrin did not look back. "We keep them from the town," he said. "And we find what woke them." As if in answer, a deeper tremor rolled through the hill, felt more than heard. At the cemetery's highest point, where the oldest graves lay forgotten and unblessed, something pulsed, a slow, sick heartbeat beneath the earth. The dead turned toward it as one. Edrin closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the night settle around him. Whatever lay buried up there had never learned how to rest. And now neither would Greyfen. The bell rang once more, and far below, the town listened. The Dhampir and the living hunters. The rain had stopped, but the forest still breathed water. Every leaf dripped, every root glistened, and the air carried the copper-sweet smell of old blood mingled with moss. Kale moved through the trees without sound, boots never slipping, cloak never catching. Night welcomed him as it always did, reluctantly, like a mother who could not quite bring herself to love her child. He felt them before he saw them. Heartbeats. Too many to ignore. Too disciplined to belong to beasts. Kale slowed, pale fingers brushing the hilt of the short blade at his side. Silver-threaded steel hummed faintly beneath his touch, reacting to his blood as much as to the things it was meant to kill. He climbed a fallen oak and crouched along its trunk, eyes narrowing as torchlight flickered between the trees ahead. 5 hunters. Living ones. They wore layered leathers and mail, practical and worn, each piece repaired too many times to count. Their cloaks bore no crest, but Kale recognized them anyway. The living hunters did not need banners. Their reputation arrived before them, carried on whispers and shallow graves. They hunted monsters. And sometimes they hunted things that only pretended not to be human. The leader knelt by the remains of a corpse, what was left of it at least. Kale recognized the signs immediately. Puncture wounds at the throat, precise and intimate, drained clean. A fledgling vampire, careless and young. Sloppy. Cold trail, one of the hunters muttered. A woman judging by the voice. She held a compact crossbow, its limbs etched with runes. But not dead long. A night, maybe 2. The leader grunted. Then we're close. Kale's jaw tightened. They always were. A branch snapped behind him. Kale spun, blade half drawn, but the sound was too deliberate. Bait, not accident. He leapt from the log as a bolt screamed through the space where his head had been. It struck bark and buried itself to the fletching, glowing briefly before the runes faded. "Dhampir," someone shouted. "In the trees." So much for subtlety. Kale hit the ground running. 2 heartbeats surged closer, hunters flanking. He slid beneath a low branch, came up with his blade flashing, and knocked a second bolt aside. The impact rang through his arm. Living hunters were never careless with their weapons. A sword met his blade. The man wielding it was broad-shouldered, breathing hard but steady. Human. Entirely. "You picked the wrong forest," the man said through clenched teeth. Kale bared his teeth in something that was not quite a smile. "You picked the wrong prey." He twisted, letting the sword glance off his guard, and drove an elbow into the man's ribs. The hunter staggered but did not fall. Tougher than most. A net whistled through the air. Kale cursed and vaulted backward as weighted links slammed into the ground where he'd been standing. The metal sizzled faintly, alchemical, laced with salt and silver dust. Meant to burn. The leader stepped forward then, tall and gray-haired, eyes sharp as broken glass. He did not raise his weapon. "Kale Varin," the man said calmly. "Half-blood. Graveborn." Kale froze. Few knew his name. Fewer still spoke it aloud without fear. "You've killed 3 creatures in the last month," the leader continued. "A white near Blackmere. A feral revenant outside Hollow Reach. And a vampire fledgling 2 nights ago. It was preying on a village," Kale snapped. "Same as the others." "So we heard," the man said. "That's why you're still breathing." The forest seemed to lean in around them, branches creaking softly. "Then let me pass," Kale said. "You hunt monsters. So do I." The woman with the crossbow snorted. "You drink blood." Kale's eyes flicked to her. "Not from children." Silence followed. Heavy. Uncomfortable. The leader studied him for a long moment. Then slowly he nodded. "Truth," he said. "Or close enough." He gestured and the others lowered their weapons, slightly. "We are tracking something," the leader said. "Not a fledgling. Not a revenant. Something older. Smarter. It leaves nothing behind but emptiness." Kale felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night. "A void eater," he said quietly. The hunters exchanged looks. "That's what the priests called it," the leader said. "You've heard of them." "I've fought one," Kale replied. "Once. And lived," the woman said, disbelief sharp in her tone. "Barely." Another silence. Finally, the leader extended a hand. He did not offer trust, only necessity. "Help us track it. When it's dead, we part ways." Kale stared at the hand. Living skin. Warm blood beneath it. A reminder of everything he was not. And everything he still protected. "If I help you," Kale said, "you don't turn on me when it's over." "On my life," the leader said without hesitation. Kale clasped the offered hand. The grip was firm. Human. Above them, clouds parted just enough for moonlight to spill through the canopy, pale and watchful. Somewhere deep in the forest, something ancient shifted, and began to hunt back. Monks, manuscripts, and the church's uneasy role. Throughout the early medieval period, monasteries stood at the center of Europe's intellectual and spiritual life. In an age marked by political fragmentation, declining urban institutions, and limited literacy, monks became the primary custodians of written knowledge. Through their labor in scriptoria, they preserved religious texts, classical literature, and practical works on medicine, astronomy, and law. Yet the church's role in this process was far from straightforward. While monasteries safeguarded learning, they also controlled it, filtering knowledge through theological priorities and institutional interests. This dual function, preserver and gatekeeper, created an uneasy tension that shaped medieval intellectual culture for centuries. Monasticism emerged in late antiquity as a movement devoted to withdrawal from worldly concerns in pursuit of spiritual perfection. By the 6th century, particularly under the influence of the rule of Saint Benedict, monasteries became stable, organized communities that balanced prayer, labor, and study. Reading was considered a form of devotion, and copying texts became an act of piety. Manuscript production was slow and demanding, requiring discipline, education, and material resources. In this context, monasteries were among the few places capable of sustaining literary culture after the decline of the Western Roman Empire. The importance of manuscripts in monastic life cannot be overstated. Books were rare, expensive, and precious. A single manuscript might require the skins of dozens of animals and months of painstaking labor. Monks trained in Latin grammar and script spent long hours copying texts by hand, often illuminating them with intricate decorations. Errors were common, but so too were marginal notes, glosses, and commentaries that reveal how monks engaged actively with what they read. Through this process, monasteries preserved not only Christian writings such as the Bible and works of the Church Fathers, but also pagan classical authors including Virgil, Cicero, and Ovid. This preservation, however, was selective. The Church did not aim to maintain classical learning for its own sake, but rather to serve Christian teaching. Pagan texts survived largely because monks found them useful for teaching Latin rhetoric, moral lessons, or historical examples. Works deemed heretical, morally dangerous, or theologically irrelevant were less likely to be copied and thus more likely to disappear. In this way, the Church functioned as a cultural filter, shaping the intellectual inheritance of medieval Europe according to its own values. The uneasy nature of this role becomes clearer when considering the Church's ambivalence towards secular knowledge. On one hand, learning was essential for training clergy, interpreting scripture, and administering ecclesiastical institutions. On the other, excessive curiosity about the natural world or ancient philosophy was often viewed with suspicion. Church authorities worried that secular learning might encourage pride, doubt, or challenges to doctrinal authority. As a result, monastic education emphasized obedience and orthodoxy over intellectual experimentation. Scriptoria themselves reflected this tension. While they were centers of remarkable productivity, they were also tightly controlled environments. Decisions about which texts to copy were influenced by abbots, bishops, and broader ecclesiastical priorities. Innovation was limited, and originality was rarely encouraged. The ideal monk was not an author seeking new ideas, but a faithful transmitter of established wisdom. Even so, the act of copying inevitably involved interpretation, and subtle changes introduced over generations could alter the meaning of texts in significant ways. Despite these constraints, monasteries laid the foundations for later intellectual developments. The Carolingian Renaissance of the 8th and 9th centuries demonstrated how monastic learning could be mobilized for broader reform. Under Charlemagne, monasteries and cathedral schools were encouraged to standardize texts, improve Latin literacy, and expand education for clergy and administrators. This effort preserved many works that might otherwise have been lost and created a more uniform intellectual culture across Western Europe. Yet even this revival remained firmly under church and imperial supervision, reinforcing the link between knowledge and authority. The church's control over manuscripts also reinforced social hierarchies. Literacy was largely confined to clergy and a small elite, limiting access to written knowledge for the wider population. Manuscripts were often chained in libraries or kept under strict supervision, emphasizing their value and restricting their use. This monopoly over learning enhanced the church's power, allowing it to define orthodoxy, shape moral teaching, and legitimize political authority. At the same time, it created resentment and resistance, particularly as new forms of learning emerged outside monastic walls. By the 12th century, the rise of universities and urban schools began to challenge the monastic dominance of knowledge. Scholasticism emphasized debate, logic, and systematic inquiry, pushing intellectual life in new directions. While the church continued to oversee education, the center of learning gradually shifted from monasteries to cities. This transition highlights the limitations of the monastic model. What had once preserved learning now risked constraining it. In retrospect, the church's role in the world of manuscripts was deeply paradoxical. Without monastic scriptoria, much of ancient and early Christian literature would have vanished. The patience, discipline, and devotion of monks ensured the survival of texts that later fueled intellectual renewal. Yet this preservation came at a cost. Knowledge was curated, controlled, and subordinated to religious authority, shaping not only what survived but how it was understood. The uneasy balance between preservation and restriction defines the church's legacy in medieval intellectual history. Monks were both guardians of the past and agents of limitation, preserving fragments of classical culture while reshaping them to fit a Christian worldview. Their manuscripts stand as symbols of this tension, beautiful, fragile, and incomplete windows into a world where faith and learning were inseparably intertwined. Austria discovers the vampire. The mist hung low over the Danube that morning, curling around the spires of Vienna like a pale, restless spirit. The city, usually alive with merchants and horse-drawn carriages, seemed hushed as if holding its breath. Even the bells of St. Stephen's Cathedral tolled with a hollow resonance, as though warning the city of some unseen terror. In the heart of the city, where the streets twisted in ancient cobblestone labyrinths, rumors had begun to spread, whispers of something unnatural, something that lurked in the night. Baron Albrecht von Hohenberg had been the first to notice it. A man of science and reason, he had spent years studying the natural world, dismissing superstition as the folly of the uneducated. Yet the reports he had received from the outskirts of the empire were disturbing. Livestock drained of blood, villagers found pale and weakened, and shadows glimpsed moving where no human could tread. At first, he tried to rationalize these occurrences as disease or banditry, but the evidence was mounting too quickly. On the evening of the 12th of October, Baron von Hohenberg convened a meeting in his study, a room lined with books on medicine, alchemy, and obscure folklore. By candlelight, he pored over the testimonies he had collected. Each was more unsettling than the last. One account described a man discovered lifeless in his home, his face frozen in a grimace of terror, 2 small punctures visible on his neck. Another spoke of a woman found wandering the forest at night, her skin nearly translucent, her eyes wide with an unearthly hunger. The baron's heart grew heavy with an unease he had never before experienced. "It cannot be mere coincidence," he murmured, tracing the map of Austria with a finger stained with ink. "These events are spreading. From the Carinthian valleys to the outskirts of Lower Austria, there is a pattern here." His servant, Franz, a nervous man prone to superstition, shuffled uneasily behind him. "Baron, perhaps it is as the villagers say. Perhaps it is a vampire," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the crackling fire. The baron stiffened. A vampire, Franz? You speak of fairy tales. Do you think I will chase shadows and ghost stories? Franz shook his head, but his pale face betrayed his fear. I do not know, my lord, but the stories, they are growing. Baron von Hohenberg rubbed his temples, feeling the weight of doubt pressing against his reason. He had never believed in such things, yet the evidence was insistent, gnawing at the edges of his skepticism. Determined to seek the truth, he resolved to journey to the villages himself, to witness these strange occurrences firsthand. The following week, he traveled under the guise of a physician, accompanied only by Franz and a trusted aide, Lieutenant Dietrich. They rode through the mist-laden countryside, past dense forests where the sunlight struggled to pierce the canopy, and over hills where the fog seemed to linger longer than it ought. At each village, they were met with wary glances and hurried whispers. Doors were bolted, windows shuttered, and in the townsfolk's eyes, Baron von Hohenberg saw the same fear he had felt when reading the reports. In the village of Hinterberg, they encountered their first undeniable evidence. A young woman named Elsbeth had been found near the woods, her clothes torn, her neck marked with the telltale punctures. Her eyes, wide and unblinking, seemed to search for something unseen. She could not speak coherently, only murmuring fragments about shadows that moved without form, about cold hands that touched her in her sleep. The Baron examined her carefully, noting the pallor of her skin and the unnatural rigidity in her movements. "This is no ordinary illness," he admitted, though the words tasted strange on his tongue. He remembered the old texts he had studied in his youth, passages warning of creatures that fed upon the living, spirits that could traverse the night unseen. He had dismissed them then, and yet now they seemed frighteningly plausible. That night he decided to keep vigil. The moon hung low over Hinterberg, casting silver light across the village square. Baron von Hohenberg and his companions stationed themselves near the forest's edge, armed with lanterns, crucifixes, and iron stakes. Hours passed in tense silence, the only sounds the distant hoot of an owl and the restless rustling of leaves. Then a shadow moved. It was swift and silent, slipping between the trees with a grace that seemed almost unnatural. Franz cried out, but the Baron motioned him to silence, straining his eyes to discern the figure. As it emerged from the forest, he saw it clearly, a figure tall and gaunt, with pale skin that seemed to glow in the moonlight and eyes that burned with a crimson hunger. The creature paused, sniffing the air, and for a moment the world seemed to hold its breath. The Baron stepped forward, heart hammering, and demanded, "What are you?" The figure's lips parted, revealing teeth sharper than any man's, and a smile that chilled him to the bone. Before he could react, it vanished into the shadows, leaving only the faint scent of iron and decay. Baron von Hohenberg knew then, without a shred of doubt, that the legends were true. Austria had indeed discovered the vampire, a creature both real and terrifying, existing just beyond the fragile veil of human understanding. The implications were immense. If such a being could thrive in the dark corners of Hinterberg, where else might it roam? How many had already fallen victim, their lives drained and their bodies hidden in plain sight? In the days that followed, he documented everything meticulously, gathering testimonies from villagers, recording the signs of the vampire's presence, and sketching the forest paths where it had been sighted. Each detail confirmed his growing dread. The creature was not bound by the rules of man or nature. It could strike silently, vanish without trace, and leave fear in its wake. By the time Baron von Hohenberg returned to Vienna, he was a changed man. His reason, once steadfast, had been shaken to its core. He carried with him not only the burden of knowledge but the certainty that a dark menace now lurked within the empire's borders. The vampire was no longer a myth whispered among frightened villagers. It was a reality, and Austria had no choice but to confront it. The vampire didn't begin as a monster of fantasy. It began as a fear shared by entire communities, so real that villages, priests, and empires acted on it. These Balkan cults weren't driven by madness, but by survival in a world where death had no clear boundary. And while history moved on, the rituals never fully disappeared. So the next time you hear a vampire story, remember, it was once a warning, not a legend. Thank you for watching and supporting the channel. If this story stayed with you, consider subscribing. The forgotten past has many more secrets waiting in the dark.